The town went silent as the mountain man took her hand. All eyes followed the unlikely pair, him, rugged and towering like the peaks he called home, her, with curves that defied society's narrow standards of beauty. "Stop, I'll buy the curvy one." His declaration still echoed in everyone's minds, words that had changed everything in their small community. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The town square bustled with life as the weekly market day reached its peak. Merchants hollered prices, sheep and goats clattered their hooves against cobblestones, and the mingled scents of salt-cured meats and raw wool hung heavy in the crisp morning air. Villagers haggled over wares, children darted between stalls, and at the far end of the square, a spectacle unfolded that made the livestock auction seem dignified by comparison. 7 women stood in a row on a wooden platform, each wearing their finest, though for most, finest meant merely clean and mended. This was the valley's infamous bride market, where debts were settled with daughters and nieces instead of coin. Among them stood Ellen, her curves more pronounced than the others, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains as if seeking escape. "Look at that one," a voice called out, "round as a harvest moon." Laughter rippled through the gathering crowd. Torvald, the town mayor, stood nearby with his chest puffed out beneath his ceremonial sash. The aging official nodded approvingly as the bidding began for the first girl. He caught Ellen's eye and smirked. 3 seasons ago, her father had borrowed heavily after a failed crop, and now the debt had come due. The mayor considered this tradition essential. It kept order, settled accounts, and reminded everyone of their proper place. "Next," called the auctioneer, motioning Ellen forward. She stepped to the center, cheeks burning crimson, but her chin remained high. The jeers grew louder. She'd eat a man out of house and home before winter's end. "You'd need extra timber just to build a bed strong enough." Each word landed like a physical blow, but Ellen refused to crumple. Her hands trembled slightly, but she clasped them tightly at her waist, standing as straight as a pine. She had known this day would come, had prepared herself for the humiliation, but the reality cut deeper than imagination ever could. 2 farmers nudged each other, whispering about offering a pittance, not because they wanted her, but for the amusement of making her work off the debt in their fields where they could mock her daily. Torvald circled the platform, ensuring the proceedings continued smoothly. "Remember," he announced to the crowd, "these arrangements honor our ancestors' ways. Debts must be paid, and these women will find purpose in new households." His words carried the weight of law, though they were merely tradition, a tradition that filled the town coffers and kept his position secure. Ellen breathed slowly, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. Each stare felt like another lash against her dignity, but she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The mountains beyond the square seemed to call to her, promising a freedom she could not reach. Not yet. The crowd parted like water around stone as Cale entered the market square. Standing a head taller than most men, the mountain man's presence commanded attention without effort. His weathered face, tanned by years of solitude on the ridges, remained expressionless as he surveyed the spectacle before him. The villagers fell silent, their mockery dying on their lips as they recognized the solitary figure who rarely ventured into town except for absolute necessities. Cale moved with deliberate steps, his gaze sweeping across the line of women until it settled on Ellen. Something in her posture, the quiet dignity despite the humiliation, caught his attention. While others cowered or wept, she stood straight, eyes forward, refusing to be broken by their cruelty. "Stop!" His voice cut through the square like a thunderclap. "I'll buy the curvy one." The words hung in the air as a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Torvald, who had been overseeing the proceedings with smug satisfaction, froze mid-sentence. The mayor's authority suddenly felt fragile in the face of this unexpected disruption. "The mountain man wants the fat one," someone whispered, loud enough to be heard across the square. A nervous titter began, but quickly died when Kale's piercing gaze swept toward the source. "Name your price," he said to Torvald, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. His calloused hand reached into a leather pouch at his belt, producing a small collection of coins that represented months of trading pelts and carved items. The mayor hesitated, caught between tradition and the unexpected turn of events. "She comes with nothing," he warned, attempting to regain control. "No dowry, no skills worth mentioning." Kale merely extended his hand toward Elin. "Your choice," he said quietly to her, offering something no one in the market had considered, a semblance of agency. Elin's fingers trembled slightly as they met his. The touch was neither romantic nor possessive, but something far more rare in the valley, respectful. She stepped forward, away from the line of women awaiting their fate. The townsfolk watched in stunned silence as Kale and Ellen walked through the square, their joined hands a defiant statement against years of cruel tradition. Greta's face contorted with jealousy, while Einar, working the bellows at his master's forge, paused to watch with conflicted emotions churning behind his eyes. As they reached the edge of the square, whispers erupted behind them. The mountain man had done more than purchase a bride. He had challenged the very foundation upon which the valley's social order rested. With each step they took toward the mountain path, the certainties of the town seemed to waver, like shadows at the edge of firelight. Ellen Bergstrom felt the stares of the townsfolk burning into her back as Kale led her away from the market square. Her hand, still trembling slightly, remained enclosed in his much larger one, calloused and warm despite the biting air. The whispers followed them like persistent shadows. "The mountain man and the fat girl," someone hissed, just loud enough to be heard. "He'll bring her back before the week's end," another voice predicted with cruel certainty. Elin kept her eyes fixed ahead, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her tears. The cobblestone streets gradually gave way to a dirt path, which narrowed as they left the valley behind. The climb began in earnest, steep and unforgiving. Her breath came in visible puffs as they ascended, the air growing thinner and colder with each step. "We'll rest here," Kale said, his first words since claiming her at the market. He gestured to a flat rock overlooking the valley. Below them, the town looked smaller than she'd ever seen it, its importance diminishing with distance. The landscape transformed around them as they continued upward. The bustling noise of the village faded, replaced by the whisper of wind through pine needles. Snow dusted the ground in patches, growing thicker as they climbed higher. Ellen's town shoes, never meant for such terrain, slipped occasionally on frozen ground. Each time, Kale's steady hand prevented her fall, though he offered no words of comfort or complaint. By late afternoon, her legs ached fiercely, and doubt began to gnaw at her resolve. What awaited her with this silent stranger? Was this truly better than the humiliation she'd left behind? They crested a final ridge, and Kale's cabin appeared before them at the edge of a small clearing. Smoke curled from the stone chimney like a welcoming finger, promising warmth within. The structure stood defiant against the mountain winds that howled across the ridges. Solid logs stacked and sealed with pitch, a steep roof designed to shed heavy snow. "Home," he said simply, releasing her hand for the first time since the market. Ellen hesitated at the threshold before following him inside. The interior revealed a world crafted entirely by one man's hands. Rough-hewn wooden furniture, thick furs draped across a simple bed frame, iron cookware hanging from ceiling beams. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The space was small but meticulously organized, every item having its proper place. The door closed behind her with a solid thud, sealing her into this new life. The daunting promise of isolation stretched before her like an uncharted wilderness. Yet somehow, in the quiet of this mountain sanctuary, the mocking laughter from the valley seemed to lose its power. Days melted into one another as Ellen settled into the rhythm of mountain life. The silence was profound, broken only by the persistent crackle of Cale's hearth fire and the rhythmic drip of snowmelt from the cabin's sturdy roof. Each morning, she woke to the pale light filtering through small windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the cold air. "You'll need thicker clothes," Cale told her on the third day, his voice gruff, but not unkind. He handed her a worn fur cloak that smelled of pine and smoke. The mountain doesn't forgive those who aren't prepared. Elin wrapped herself in the heavy garment, grateful for its warmth. The mountain man moved through his daily tasks with practiced efficiency, chopping wood before dawn, checking traps at midday, and mending tools by firelight. She watched, learned, and soon began to mirror his movements, determined to be useful rather than burdensome. Her hands, once soft from valley life, grew calloused as she learned to split kindling without splitting her fingers. The mountain air, sharp as a knife's edge, stung her lungs at first, but gradually strengthened her. Each breath became easier, deeper, more confident. Down in the valley, tongues wagged incessantly. Greta gathered the town women around her loom, predicting Elin's imminent return. "She won't last a fortnight," the spiteful woman declared, her eyes narrowed with envy. "That soft body wasn't made for mountain hardship. I'll wager she comes crawling back before the first true frost." The other women nodded, some with genuine concern, others with malicious hope. Torvald encouraged such talk, uncomfortable with the disruption to his carefully maintained order. The mayor paced his home, muttering about traditions undone and authority questioned. Meanwhile, Elin discovered an unexpected joy in the simplicity of mountain existence. She learned to mend furs with neat, tight stitches that kept the cold at bay. She mastered the art of banking coals to keep the fire alive through the night. When Cale returned from hunting, she helped prepare the meat, wasting nothing. "You're adapting well," he remarked one evening, surprise evident in his tone as he watched her efficiently tan a small hide. Elin smiled, the expression reaching her eyes for the first time since leaving the valley. "People see what they expect to see," she replied softly. "In the town, they expected weakness, so that's what they saw." The mountain man nodded, understanding in his gaze. That night they sat closer to the fire, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song across the ridges, but inside the cabin, something new and fragile was taking root, something neither had dared hope for when they'd left the market square behind. The first frost had begun to creep across the mountain slopes, as Cale prepared for the harsh winter ahead. Each morning, he would rise before dawn, chopping firewood until sweat glistened on his brow despite the chill. Elin watched him from the cabin doorway, learning the rhythm of mountain life, still uncertain of her place in this new world. One afternoon, while exploring the dusty corners of the cabin, Ellen discovered a forgotten treasure tucked beneath a pile of furs, a battered wooden loom, and several sacks of unspun wool. Her fingers traced the worn frame with unexpected familiarity. "It belonged to my mother," Cale explained, his voice softer than usual. "No one's touched it in years." Ellen's face brightened. "May I use it?" The mountain man nodded, returning to his work outside while she carefully assembled the loom near the hearth where light was best. Something awakened in her as she worked the wool, her hands remembering skills she hadn't known she possessed. Days passed as she carded, spun, and finally began to weave. The patterns that emerged weren't the simple designs common in the valley. Instead, her cloth captured the jagged silhouettes of mountain peaks against twilight skies, the scattered patterns of stars visible from their high perch, and the swirling dance of snow across stone. Cale found himself pausing in his chores to watch her work, mesmerized by the confidence in her movements. "Where did you learn to weave like that?" he asked one evening. "My grandmother taught me," she replied, not looking up from her shuttle. "Before she died, before the debts." He didn't press further, understanding the weight behind her words. 3 weeks into winter, a fierce storm descended upon them. Wind howled through the pines, rattling the cabin's shutters and sending snow swirling down the chimney. In the small stable attached to the dwelling, Cale's mule began to kick and bray in terror as thunder cracked overhead. "He'll hurt himself," Cale muttered, struggling to calm the panicked animal. Ellen approached cautiously, standing just beyond the stall. Then, surprising them both, she began to sing. Her voice rose clear and steady above the storm's fury. A simple melody about spring meadows and gentle streams. The mule's ears pricked forward, its frantic movements gradually stilling as she continued. Cale stood transfixed, watching as both beast and storm seemed to yield to her song. The warmth in her voice filled the rough-hewn space, transforming it from mere shelter to something that felt remarkably like home. When their eyes met across the stable, something shifted between them, an unspoken recognition that perhaps they had both found something neither had dared hope for on that fateful day in the market square. The whispers began as soon as Elin and Cale left the village that day. Greta, whose own market day had passed without notice 3 seasons prior, watched them depart with narrowed eyes. By morning, she had crafted a tale so compelling that even the skeptical butcher's wife leaned in to hear more. "Mountain herbs," Greta hissed to the women gathered at the well. "I saw her gathering them myself before the market. Strange ones that grow only in moonlight." She tapped her temple knowingly. Why else would a man like him choose her? There's witchcraft in it. The accusation spread through the valley like wildfire. Some villagers crossed themselves when Elin's name was mentioned, while others simply shook their heads at the absurdity. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted, and it flourished in the fertile soil of tradition and fear. "My grandmother warned of women who know the old ways," muttered an elderly farmer as he traded grain for salt. "Said they could turn a man's mind with a tea brewed just so." Even Hildy, the folk healer who had taught Ellen which herbs soothed coughs and which eased pain, found herself defending her former pupil. "The girl has a gift for weaving, not witchcraft," she insisted. But her words carried less weight than the thrill of scandal. Torvald observed it all from the steps of the town hall, his face impassive, but his mind calculating. The mayor had built his authority on predictability and tradition. The bride market wasn't merely custom, it was control. If one man could defy it without consequence, others might follow. When Cale's broad-shouldered figure appeared in town to trade furs for supplies, Torvald saw his opportunity. He summoned the mountain man with a gesture that brooked no refusal. "You've caused quite a stir," Torvald said, his voice pleasant, but his eyes cold as winter stone. They stood in the mayor's office, where the walls were adorned with records of debts and obligations. "Taking the girl as you did, it undermines the natural order." Cale remained silent, his face unreadable beneath his beard. "The iron games approach," Torvald continued, running his finger along the edge of his desk. "A time when men prove their worth before the community. A time when accidents happen." He smiled thinly. "I would hate to see your mountain hospitality repaid with valley hostility." The threat hung in the air between them, as tangible as the dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight from the window. "Are you finished?" Cale asked, his voice low and steady. Torvald's smile faltered. "Consider yourself warned. The bride market has existed for generations. One mountain man cannot change what has always been." Cale turned to leave, pausing at the threshold. "Perhaps," he said, "what has always been deserves to change." The midsummer sun beat down on the valley as the Iron Games commenced, drawing townsfolk from every corner to witness feats of strength and endurance. Wooden platforms had been erected in the town square, where competitors would test themselves against one another in traditions as old as the mountains themselves. Kale arrived alone, his broad shoulders and weathered face instantly recognizable among the crowd. The Mountain Man had been undefeated champion 3 years running, though he rarely participated in town gatherings. Whispers followed him as he registered his name with Torvald, who could barely conceal his contempt. "The hermit returns," someone muttered, loud enough for others to hear. "Thinks he can claim our prizes and our women?" The mayor smiled thinly, handing Kale his competitor's token. "Perhaps this year you'll find worthy opposition," Torvald said, his voice carrying across the square. "Men who understand the value of our traditions." Elin arrived shortly after, having walked down from the mountain cabin alone. She wore a simple dress with one of her own woven shawls draped across her shoulders. Several women turned away as she approached, while Greta loudly remarked how shameless it was for her to appear in public. The first events began with log carrying and stone lifting. Kale moved through the challenges methodically, his strength evident but never flaunted. When he completed the axe-throwing competition with 3 perfect strikes, a reluctant murmur of appreciation rippled through the onlookers. "That's it, Kale," Elin called out, her voice clear and strong above the crowd. "Show them what mountain men are made of." Her cheer cut through the murmurs, drawing shocked stares and hisses of disapproval. Women didn't shout at the games. They observed quietly, offering modest congratulations afterward. "The shame of her," Greta whispered loudly to her companions. "No wonder she was sold at market. No decent family could bear such embarrassment." Kale's head snapped toward the source of the insult, his eyes narrowing dangerously. In the wrestling circle moments later, his opponents felt the full force of his rage. The blacksmith's son, a favorite to challenge Kale's reign, found himself pinned in mere seconds. 2 more challengers fell just as quickly. When Torvald presented the winner's wreath, the mayor's smile never reached his eyes. "Congratulations," he said stiffly, though some victories cost more than their worth. Kale took the wreath and walked directly to Elin, placing it in her hands before the entire assembly, an unprecedented gesture that left the crowd gasping. As they departed together, heads held high, the whispers behind them grew louder, the rift between mountain and valley deepening with every step. Einar Svensson wiped the sweat from his brow as he hammered the glowing metal, each strike echoing his conflicted heart. From the smithy's doorway, he had watched the iron games with clenched fists. Seeing Kale triumph, while Ellen cheered from the crowd, had been harder than plunging his hands into ice water after working the forge all day. The young apprentice had noticed Ellen long before the bride market. He'd admired her from afar as she brought wool to trade at the square, her confident stride and warm smile making his hammer miss its mark more than once. But he'd never found the courage to speak to her, and now she belonged to the Mountain Man. "More force on the downswing," his master called, pulling Einar from his thoughts. The smith had little patience for distraction, especially with orders piling up after the games. Yet even as he focused on his work, the apprentice's eyes drifted toward the window whenever a flash of color passed by, hoping it might be her. 3 days later, his vigilance was rewarded. Ellen appeared in the village square, carrying a basket of woven goods to trade. Without thinking, Einar set down his tools and slipped outside, his heart hammering harder than any metal he'd ever shaped. "Let me help you with that," he offered, reaching for the heavy water bucket she struggled with at the well. Their fingers brushed briefly, and he felt his face grow hotter than the forge. "Thank you, Einar," she replied, recognition lighting her eyes. "The smith's apprentice, yes? I remember your father commissioned my mother's loom years ago." He nodded, surprised and pleased she knew who he was. "It's nothing. The bucket gets heavier when the well's low." Over the following weeks, whenever Ellen made the journey down from the mountain, the young man found reasons to be nearby. He carried her purchases, stacked firewood she'd bought, and once even repaired her basket handle with a strip of metal he'd crafted himself. "Cale doesn't mind your help?" he finally asked one day, unable to keep the question inside any longer. Ellen smiled, her expression unreadable. "Cale knows kindness when he sees it," she answered simply. The apprentice felt both relief and disappointment in that answer. His feelings for her remained, burning like embers beneath ash, neither fully extinguished nor allowed to flame. He found himself in an impossible position, resenting the mountain man, yet respecting the protection and dignity Cale had given her when no one else would. As winter approached, Einar crafted a small iron pendant in secret, a mountain flower design he'd seen in her weaving. He kept it wrapped in cloth in his pocket, waiting for the right moment to give it to her, knowing it might never come. His kindness continued, even as the line between resentment and longing grew increasingly blurred with each passing day. The first snow came earlier than expected, blanketing the mountain in a pristine white shroud. By the time the moon had completed its cycle, winter had sunk its teeth deep into the valley, transforming Cale's cabin into an island amidst a frozen sea. Drifts piled against the walls, sometimes reaching the windowsills, forcing the mountain man to carve pathways each morning just to reach the woodpile. Inside, Elin moved about the small space with growing confidence. Her hands, once soft from valley life, had toughened from months of work. Today, she kneaded dough on the rough-hewn table, incorporating herbs that Hildy had shown her during their last meeting before the passes closed. The rosemary wards off winter sickness, she explained to Cale as he entered, shaking snow from his coat, and the sage brings warmth to the blood. He watched her work, mesmerized by the rhythmic motion of her fingers pressing into the soft dough. "My mother used to bake like that," he said quietly, a rare mention of his past. Elin smiled, but didn't press for more. Their relationship had evolved into something neither had expected. A comfortable silence punctuated by moments of genuine connection. Each shared story was a gift, freely given rather than demanded. When the bread baked in the stone hearth, the cabin filled with aromas that transported Elin back to childhood memories of warmth and safety. Yet this place felt increasingly like home, not the valley she'd left behind, but something new she was building with her own hands. The days grew shorter, darkness claiming more hours than light. They developed rituals to mark time, tending the fire, checking traps for rabbits, mending clothes by lamplight. One evening, as wind howled across the mountainside, Cale taught her to carve simple figures from pine scraps. "You're better at this than I am," he admitted when her wooden bird took shape more elegantly than his bear. Elin laughed, the sound bright against the storm's fury outside. "I have nimble fingers from weaving. Your hands are made for stronger work." Their laughter came more easily now, bridging gaps that once seemed unbridgeable. They shared stories of summer adventures and village gossip, finding humor in memories that had once held pain. During the coldest nights, they huddled near the fire, wrapped in the blankets she had woven, their shoulders touching as they watched flames dance. In those moments, the harshness beyond their walls seemed to strengthen rather than threaten what grew between them. "I never thought I'd be grateful for winter," Elin whispered one night as they listened to ice crystals tapping against the windows. Cale's hand found hers in the firelight. "Nor I," he replied simply, and the understanding that passed between them needed no further words. The snow fell in gentle drifts outside as Hildy knocked on the cabin door, her weathered hands clutching a bundle of dried herbs. Elin welcomed the folk healer with genuine warmth, grateful for the rare visitor during these isolated winter months. Cale nodded respectfully from his place by the hearth, where he continued carving a wooden spoon while the women settled near the fire. "I've brought mountain sage and pine needle tea," Hildy said, unwrapping her package. "Good for keeping the winter cough away." As the kettle bubbled over the flames, The older woman's eyes crinkled with something like mischief. The healer began sharing tales from the valley's oldest memories, stories passed down through generations of women who had lived among these peaks long before the current town existed. "You know," Hilda said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "in the time of our ancestors, a woman with your figure was considered blessed by the mountain spirits." Her gnarled finger pointed directly at Elin. They believed curves meant abundance would follow wherever she walked. Elin's hands stilled around her cup. Truly? Indeed. The Ancient Ones saw a woman's fullness as a promise that her home would never know hunger, that her children would thrive, that her presence would bring prosperity. The healer's eyes gleamed in the firelight. It was only in recent generations that the valley folk forgot this wisdom. Kale looked up from his carving, watching the emotions play across Ellen's face. He had never seen her expression quite like this. Wonder mixed with something deeper, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally connecting. "The shrine tapestries show it," Hilda continued, sipping her tea. "The ancient mother figures all have bodies like yours. They were revered, not mocked." That night, after the healer had departed, Ellen stood before the small polished metal that served as their mirror. For the first time since the market, she didn't avert her eyes from her reflection. Instead, she traced the curves of her silhouette with newfound appreciation. In the days that followed, something subtle yet profound shifted in Ellen. She moved differently, her shoulders straighter, her steps more assured. When she laughed, the sound rang fuller and more genuine, no longer tinged with the self-consciousness that had shadowed her since the market's cruelty. Tale noticed the change immediately. He found himself watching her more often, the way her hands confidently worked the loom, how she hummed while kneading bread with Hildy's herbs. The mountain man who had once been content with solitude now found himself drawn to her warmth, like a traveler to firelight. One evening, as they sat side by side watching embers glow, Elin's hand found his, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. Her touch carried not gratitude for rescue, but the assurance of a woman who finally understood her own worth. The mountains had always brought winter's fury, but this year's blizzard descended with unprecedented wrath. Snow piled against Kale's cabin, winds howling like hungry wolves as ice crystals formed on the window edges. Inside, Ellen stoked the hearth fire, while Kale secured the last of their provisions. "The passes will be blocked for days," he muttered, brushing snow from his shoulders. Their relative safety was shattered when frantic knocking echoed through the cabin. Einar stood at their threshold, face raw from the cold, panic in his eyes. "Children!" the smith's apprentice gasped. "3 of them went sledding beyond the east meadow, haven't returned." Kale exchanged a single glance with Ellen. No words needed. He grabbed his thickest furs while she gathered supplies, bread with Hilda's herbs for strength, bandages, and the special lantern she'd reinforced with metal from Einar's forge. "You'll never find them in this," Einar protested as Kale prepared to leave. "He won't go alone," Ellen said, wrapping herself in layers of her own woven cloth, designed to repel moisture while trapping heat. The journey down the mountain path was treacherous. Snow whipped their faces, visibility reduced to arm's length. Ellen held the lantern high, its flame protected by her special design, a gift that now meant life or death. The young woman who had once been mocked in the town square now moved with determination through a storm that had cowed even the bravest villagers. They found the first child, huddled beneath a fallen pine, lips blue with cold. The second lay nearby, trying desperately to shield the youngest. Kale lifted 2 while Ellen carried the smallest, a girl no more than 5 years old. "Stay with me," she whispered, pressing the child close to share body heat. "Tell me about the doll your mother makes you." The return journey tested every limit. Twice they nearly lost their way, saved only by Kale's intimate knowledge of the mountain and Ellen's unwavering light. When they finally stumbled into town, Half frozen, but with 3 living children, the waiting families erupted in tearful gratitude. Torvald watched from the doorway of his home, his expression unreadable as the mountain man and the woman once sold at market became the center of the town's relief and joy. Hildy immediately took charge of the children, her experienced hands working to restore warmth to small bodies. "You risked everything," one mother sobbed, clutching Ellen's hands. "The mountain teaches survival," she replied simply. That night, as they returned to their cabin, something had shifted. The valley no longer viewed them as outsiders, but as protectors. The mountain's harsh lessons of endurance, passed from Kale to Elin and now to the town below, had forged an unexpected bridge. In saving the children, they had transformed from curiosities into heroes, the silence of their isolation now broken by the warmth of genuine respect. The valley thawed as winter released its grip, and the Festival of Lanterns brought the promise of renewal. Elin and Kale descended from their mountain home, her fingers still bearing the calluses of weaving, his steps sure against the muddy path. The town square, once the site of her humiliation, now glowed with hundreds of paper lanterns waiting to be released into the night sky. "It feels different," Elin whispered, her hand finding Kale's as they approached the gathering. The mountain man nodded, his vigilant eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. Families clustered together, children bouncing with excitement as they clutched their lanterns. The annual tradition honored those who had passed beyond and sought blessings for the coming seasons. Torvald stood on a platform, his mayoral robes freshly pressed, performing the rituals with practiced authority while pointedly avoiding looking in their direction. Hild approached them, offering 2 lanterns with a warm smile. "The ancestors watch tonight," the healer murmured, pressing the delicate paper structures into their hands. "They see how paths change." As darkness fell completely, the first lanterns rose into the sky, their warm light creating constellations against the black canvas above. Elin released hers, watching it join the others, a prayer for continued strength on her lips. It was then that Merrick's voice cut through the reverent silence. The traveling minstrel had positioned himself near the center of the square, his fingers plucking a haunting melody from his lute. "Hear the tale of the mountain beast," he sang, "who stole the Curvy maiden from the market's feast." Heads turned, and Ellen felt her cheeks burn. The minstrel continued, his voice rising and falling dramatically as he painted Kale as a wild savage who had claimed her like a prize. In his song, Ellen became a temptress who had bewitched the mountain man with curves and charms. "I should silence him," Kale growled, taking a step forward, but Ellen caught his arm. "Let him sing," she said. "Stories change with each telling." The melody spread through the crowd like wildfire. Some listeners snickered behind their hands, while others hummed along with secret admiration in their eyes. Greta watched from across the square, her face twisted with displeasure as she noted how many seemed captivated rather than disgusted. By the time the last lantern disappeared into the night sky, Merrick's song had taken on a life of its own. What had begun as mockery had somehow transformed, in the telling, into something closer to legend. "They're making us into something we're not," Kale muttered as they walked home later, the valley quiet beneath the stars. Ellen smiled, watching the last glimmers of light fade in the distance. Perhaps, but sometimes a story becomes true simply because people need it to be. The Festival of Lanterns transformed the valley town into a sea of golden light. Ellen stood at the edge of the gathering, her hands cradling an unlit paper lantern. The mountain air carried whispers and glances her way, some curious, others still tinged with judgment. She watched as Torvald performed the ceremonial lighting of the first lantern, his booming voice reciting ancient blessings while his eyes deliberately avoided her presence. Kale stood beside her, a silent mountain of support. "You don't have to participate if you don't want to," he murmured, his calloused hand finding hers in the shadows. "I need to," she replied, her voice steady as she stepped forward into the circle of light. The crowd parted slightly as Elin approached the ceremonial flame. She could feel Torvald's disapproving glare burning into her back, but she didn't falter. With deliberate movements, she lit her lantern and held it before her face. The warm glow illuminated her features as she closed her eyes and whispered words meant only for herself and the ancestors. "I thank you not for rescue, but for the strength to find my own worth." Instead of immediately releasing her lantern skyward, as tradition dictated, Elin held it at chest height, letting its light wash over her. The curvy silhouette she had once been mocked for now stood proud in the lantern's glow. From the crowd, a woman stepped forward, Hildy, the folk healer, her weathered face solemn as she lit her own lantern and stood beside Elin. Then another woman joined, and another. Women who had once been paraded in the bride market, judged for their appearances or dismissed for their circumstances, now formed a circle of light. Torvald shifted uncomfortably on his ceremonial platform. "Release the lanterns to the sky," he commanded, his voice sharper than usual. But for several heartbeats more, the women held their ground, their lanterns creating a constellation of defiance at ground level, before finally, one by one, they released them to the night sky. As Ellen's lantern floated upward, joining dozens of others in their ascent, she felt something shift within the crowd. Whispers traveled like ripples through water. Children pointed in wonder. Even some of the men nodded with newfound respect. "What did you wish for?" Cale asked, later as they watched the last of the lanterns disappear into the darkness. Ellen smiled, her face serene in the fading light. "I didn't wish, I promised." The next morning, 3 women approached Ellen at the market, asking to learn her weaving techniques. And though Greta still sneered from her stall, and Torvald still frowned from the town hall steps, something had changed in the valley's heart. A small flame of possibility, as persistent as the lanterns that had illuminated the night sky. Torvald paced his chambers, his weathered face twisted with concern. The mayor had watched with growing alarm as Ellen's influence spread through the valley like wildfire. What had begun as a humiliating spectacle at the bride market had somehow transformed into something dangerous. Respect. "She cannot be allowed to continue," he muttered to his attendant. By nightfall, a decree was issued throughout the town. The weaving circles, where women gathered to work and share stories, were now closed to outsiders. The message was clear to everyone. Ellen was not welcome. "It's for the preservation of our traditions," Torvald announced in the square, though his eyes betrayed his true concern. The mountain woman's growing popularity threatened the very foundation of his authority. Greta seized upon this opportunity with desperate enthusiasm. Standing before the other women at the next gathering, she held up her tangled threads with trembling hands. "Look what she's done!" she cried, displaying her ruined work. "The mountain witch has cursed my loom out of jealousy." Several women stepped back, crossing themselves, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Greta had never been particularly skilled with the loom, even before Ellen's arrival. Meanwhile, at the village shrine, where townsfolk left offerings for good harvests and healthy births, the elderly caretaker made a startling discovery. Hidden behind a wooden panel, apparently placed there in secrecy, was a small tapestry. The weaving depicted the mountain ridges under starlight, with intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with life in the candlelight. "This is Ellen's work," the caretaker whispered, recognizing the distinctive style that had become so sought after. She summoned the priestess, who studied the tapestry with reverent fingers. "The ancestors have spoken," the priestess declared, after long contemplation. "These patterns are sacred signs, protection against the harsh winter to come." She pointed to the woven stars, and these, symbols of fertility and abundance. Word spread quickly. Women whispered in doorways and men discussed it over ale. the tapestry was displayed prominently in the shrine, drawing visitors who touched it with hopeful fingers. Hildy, visiting the shrine herself, smiled knowingly. The old ways recognize truth, she told those gathered. The mountain has always been sacred, and now its daughter speaks through thread. Even Einar came to see the tapestry, standing silent and thoughtful before it. The smith's apprentice ran his calloused fingers over the edge of the weaving, remembering how he had secretly helped Ellen carry wool during her rare visits to town. By week's end, Torvald's decree seemed hollow. Though Ellen remained physically absent from the weaving circles, her influence had only grown stronger. The whispers had changed from mockery to wonder, from suspicion to reverence. In the mountain cabin, unaware of the commotion below, Ellen continued to weave by firelight, her patterns flowing from hands that had finally found their purpose. The caravan appeared on the horizon, like a serpent winding its way through the valley. Word had traveled faster than the merchants themselves. Tales of a mountain woman whose cloth captured the essence of the peaks in patterns unseen in the southern markets. Ellen had not expected her weaving to draw such attention, yet here they were, 20 wagons strong, their wooden wheels creaking beneath the weight of goods from distant lands. The lead merchant, a woman with sun-weathered skin and jingling bracelets, dismounted before Cale's cabin. She introduced herself as Mira and held up a sample of Ellen's work that had somehow found its way to her hands. "I'll pay double what you've been getting," Mira declared, her eyes shrewd but appreciative. "These patterns, they speak of something ancient. My buyers across 3 valleys will fight for such work." By midday, a crowd had gathered as Ellen brought out her store of woven goods. The cloth changed hands for more coin than most villagers saw in a season. The metallic clink of payment echoed across the clearing, drawing more onlookers, including Torvald himself, who stood at the edge of the gathering with thinning lips and narrowed eyes. "That's more than our quarterly taxes," someone whispered, as Mira counted out payment for a particularly intricate piece that had taken Ellen 2 full moons to complete. Cale stood beside his wife, his presence protective yet proud. The mountain man who had once been known only for his solitude now found himself at the center of unexpected prosperity. He watched as the townsfolk's expressions shifted from curiosity to astonishment, then to something harder to define, a reluctant respect tinged with envy. Hildy pushed through the crowd, her weathered hands touching Ellen's shoulder. "The ancestors smile," the healer murmured. They knew what the valley had forgotten, that abundance flows from the hands of those the town once mocked. Even Greta could not deny the evidence before her. The envious woman lingered at the edge of the gathering, her face a storm of conflicting emotions as she watched gold and silver pass into Elin's hands. By sunset, the merchants had commissioned enough work to keep Elin busy until the next thaw. As the caravan prepared to continue its journey, Mira approached the couple one last time. "We'll return with the spring," she promised. "Your hands have woven more than cloth, they've woven fortune." As the wagons rolled away, the townsfolk dispersed slowly, carrying with them the unsettling realization that the woman they had once placed on the market block as merchandise now held more wealth than many of them combined. The power of tradition, so long unquestioned in the valley, seemed suddenly fragile beneath the weight of Elin's success and the respect it commanded. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and the gentle thaw of mountain snow. As the valley awakened from winter's grip, Cale and Elin descended from their cabin, leading a small procession that would change everything. The pair rode side by side, their mules steady beneath them, while behind them followed 3 merchant wagons laden with Elin's exquisite weavings, tapestries that told stories of mountain winds and starlit nights. The town square bustled with its usual market day activity, but a hush fell over the crowd as the unusual caravan approached. Townsfolk paused mid-transaction, their eyes widening at the sight of the mountain man and the woman they once mocked, now returning with an air of quiet confidence. "Look at her," whispered a woman to her neighbor. "The same Ellen they laughed at last spring." Ellen sat tall on her mount, her cheeks flushed not with shame, but with purpose. The merchants following her had spread word of her skill from 3 valleys over, calling her work touched by the ancestors. Each piece she'd woven through the winter months had fetched prices that left even Cale speechless. Torvald emerged from the town hall, his face darkening at the sight of the procession. The mayor strode forward, arms crossed over his chest as he positioned himself in the center of the square. "This market is for established traders," he announced loudly, "not upstarts from the mountain." Cale dismounted in one fluid motion, his presence commanding respect even from those who resented him. "The market is for trade," he countered simply. "And we've come to trade." A merchant from the northern valley stepped forward, his coin purse visibly heavy at his belt. "I've traveled 6 days to see the mountain weavers work," he declared. "You would turn away good coin from your town?" Others murmured in agreement. A crowd gathered around the wagons as the merchants began displaying Ellen's tapestries, rich with colors drawn from mountain herbs that Hildy had taught her to use. The patterns seemed to move in the spring breeze, telling stories that stirred something ancient in those who viewed them. Torvald's authority wavered visibly as townspeople pressed forward, eager to see what had drawn merchants from so far. Even Greta stood speechless, her usual sharp tongue silenced by the undeniable beauty of what her former victim had created. "The council will hear about this," Torvald muttered, but his words carried no weight as coins began to change hands. Ellen caught Einer's eye across the crowd. The smith's apprentice offered a small, genuine smile before turning back to his forge. Something in the old order had shifted, like ice breaking on the river, slow at first, then all at once. By midday, the old marketplace had transformed. The mountain had come to the valley, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The town council chamber buzzed with tension as members filed in, their faces drawn with the weight of decision. Merchants from 3 neighboring valleys had petitioned for permanent trading rights with Elin, whose distinctive mountain-patterned textiles had become sought after far beyond their isolated community. The shrine priestess stood solemnly in the corner, holding the tapestry discovered months earlier, its intricate design now interpreted as a blessing from the ancestors. Elin sat beside Cale, her hands steady despite the scrutiny. The mountain man's presence was like a shield beside her, his weathered face revealing nothing as Torvald called the meeting to order. The mayor's voice carried its usual authority, though something new flickered behind his eyes: uncertainty. "The matter before us concerns trade rights and rent? Pard. Unusual circumstances," Torvald began, his gaze deliberately avoiding Elin. "Our traditions have served us well for generations." An elderly councilwoman named Sigrid, whose silence usually marked council meetings, suddenly spoke. "Traditions that bring prosperity serve us. Those that prevent it must be reconsidered." Her words fell like stones in still water, rippling through the chamber. The head merchant stepped forward, jingling a pouch of coins. 6 villages now request Elin's weavings. The valley could benefit greatly from such trade. Whispers erupted as council members calculated potential profits against the cost of changing tradition. Hildy, standing near the shrine priestess, nodded encouragingly toward Elin. The folk healer had witnessed firsthand how the young woman's dignity had inspired others. Torvald's knuckles whitened around his ceremonial staff. "And what of our customs? Our ways?" "Our ways included the bride market," Cale said quietly, his first words cutting through the chamber like a blade. "Perhaps not all traditions deserve preservation." The council deliberated for hours, voices rising and falling like the mountain winds. When they finally emerged, the town square had filled with curious onlookers, Greta among them, her face pinched with anticipation. "The council has reached its decision," announced the eldest member, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "In recognition of exceptional skill and the prosperity brought to our valley, we hereby name Elin as Mistress of the Weaving Guild." A collective gasp rippled through the gathering. Never had such a title been bestowed upon an outsider, let alone a woman once mocked in the very square where she now stood honored. Greta's mouth fell open in speechless shock. Beside her, Torvald's face darkened like storm clouds, but even he remained silent before the council's unanimous verdict. Across the square, women exchanged glances of wonder and possibility. Young girls whispered excitedly, pointing at Ellen with newfound admiration. The curvy woman who had once stood on display as merchandise now stood tall as a guild mistress, her transformation complete. In that moment, the mountain's queen of dignity had truly emerged, her journey from shame to reverence reshaping the valley's heart. The valley glowed with 1,000 floating lights as the Festival of Lanterns reached its culmination. This year, however, something unprecedented was taking place. The townsfolk gathered in a wide circle at the festival grounds, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of paper lanterns as they witnessed the birth of a new tradition. Ellen stood in the center, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Gone was the woman who had once been mocked in the market square. In her place stood the mistress of the Weaving Guild, her intricate hand-woven dress showcasing patterns inspired by the mountain shadows that had become her home. Hilda approached with reverence, carrying a garland woven from delicate mountain flowers, bluebells, edelweiss, and wild heather, gathered from the highest slopes. "These blooms survive the harshest conditions," the folk healer announced as she placed the crown upon Elin's head. "Just as you have, daughter of the mountain." Kale watched from a few paces away, his usually stoic expression softened with undisguised pride. When beckoned forward by the village elders, the mountain man stepped into the circle, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as they took Elin's. Even Torvald stood silent, his authority diminished by the weight of change sweeping through his domain. Children scattered petals at their feet, while the elders bound their hands with a ribbon woven on Elin's loom. The fabric shimmered with threads of silver, catching the lantern light like captured stars. "From this day forward," announced the eldest of the council, her voice carrying across the hushed gathering, "the Festival of Lanterns shall honor not just our ancestors, but the courage to forge new paths." Merrick the minstrel strummed his instrument, beginning a ballad that no longer painted them as savage and temptress, but as harbingers of renewal. The melody wove through the crowd, carrying with it the story that had transformed their valley. Einar watched from the edge of the gathering, his smith's apprentice hands clutching a small iron token he'd crafted as a gift. Though his heart still carried the echo of what might have been, his eyes showed genuine happiness for the woman who had inadvertently taught the entire valley about dignity. As the couple turned to face the crowd, a collective gasp rose. Behind them, hundreds of lanterns ascended into the night sky, creating a river of light flowing upward to the stars. The townsfolk, once divided by gossip and tradition, stood united in witness to something profound, how a single act of defiance had rippled outward to reshape their world. In that moment, bathed in lantern light with their joined hands raised high, Ellen and Kale were no longer just two people who had found each other against all odds. They had become living symbols of a story the valley would tell for generations to come. The valley's embrace of Elin and Kale's story did not mean all storms had passed. Though Elin now carried the respected title of Mistress of the Weaving Guild, whispers still followed her through the marketplace. Some traditions died slowly, their roots tangled deep in the soil of generations. Torvald, his authority diminished but pride intact, found subtle ways to undermine their standing. The mayor would casually mention the unusual circumstances of their union whenever merchants gathered, his words dripping with implication. He imposed higher taxes on mountain trade routes, claiming the need for proper regulation of goods flowing from the highlands. "Pay him no mind," Kale would tell her, his calloused hand covering hers as they walked back toward the mountain. "His words are just wind against stone." The mountain man had grown more protective, not less, since their triumph. He recognized the lingering prejudice in certain glances, the way some villagers still averted their eyes when Elin approached. Greta remained their most persistent shadow. The woman had taken to positioning her market stall directly opposite Elin's tapestries, loudly proclaiming her own wares were made by proper valley hands. Her slander had evolved from whispers to thinly veiled insults about mountain witchery woven into cloth. During one particularly harsh winter, when food grew scarce throughout the region, these tensions threatened to boil over. Several villagers, led by Torvald's supporters, suggested the mountain folk should share their stored provisions, implying Elin and Kale had somehow hoarded resources unfairly. "We earned every grain through honest trade," Elin responded firmly at the town meeting, standing tall despite the accusations. "But we will share what we can, as neighbors should." That night in their cabin, as snow piled against the windows and wind howled through the pines, Elin wept not from hurt, but from exhaustion. Kale built up the hearth fire and wrapped a fur around her shoulders. "They will never truly accept me," she whispered. "Perhaps not all," he agreed, his voice low and steady. "But you've won more hearts than you know." These moments of doubt and defiance became the rhythm of their days. When spring brought new challenges, they faced them together. When summer brought drought, they shared their well. Each trial seemed to forge something stronger between them, a bond of shared purpose that transcended mere survival. Their laughter echoed more freely now across the mountain slopes. Their hands found each other in darkness. The cabin that had once felt like exile now radiated with warmth and life, a sanctuary against whatever storms might come. The lanterns drifted upward like stars returning to the heavens, their gentle light illuminating the faces of those gathered below. Kale turned to her, his weathered face softened in the gentle light. "The mountain is wiser than I ever was," he replied, a rare smile crossing his features. Below them, the townsfolk moved through the festival grounds with a reverence that would have been unimaginable seasons before. Children ran with small lanterns, their laughter rising like music. Even Torvald stood at a distance. His authority diminished, but his grudging respect evident in the slight nod he offered when their eyes met. "Look at them," Elin said, gesturing toward a group of young women who wore her woven patterns proudly. "They no longer hide their bodies or their voices." The mountain man squeezed her hand. "Because of you." "Because of us," she corrected. "Your courage that day gave me the chance to find mine." A soft breeze carried the scent of mountain flowers, reminiscent of the garland she had worn during their union ceremony. Einar approached with his new bride, offering a small wooden carving as a gift. The smith's apprentice had found his own path to happiness, his former longing transformed into genuine friendship. Hilda joined them, her wise eyes crinkling with satisfaction. "The ancestors are pleased," the healer said simply, nodding toward the tapestry that now hung prominently in the village shrine. "They sent the Curvy one to teach us what we had forgotten." Elin laughed, the sound clear and unashamed. "I am no longer the Curvy one for sale," she said. "I am just Elin." "You are everything," Kale whispered, his words meant only for her ears. As the last lanterns disappeared into the night sky, the couple began their journey back to their cabin. The path between mountain and valley was well worn now, a bridge between worlds once separated by misunderstanding and fear. Together, they had weathered storms both literal and figurative. They had transformed mockery into reverence, isolation into community, and most miraculously, had woven respect into love, a fabric stronger than any that could be created on Ellen's loom. And as they walked home beneath the stars, the mountain welcomed them, no longer silent sentinels, but witnesses to a tradition reborn.